My name is Jenna. I'm 28. I live alone in a small studio apartment in the city, and that Christmas was supposed to be quiet. I didn't have trips planned. I didn't have guests coming over. I didn't even have a real schedule beyond a few days off work. That's why it caught me off guard when I realized my holiday had already been decided for me, not discussed, not asked about, just assumed. I was expected to watch 6 kids over Christmas full days, multiple nights, as if it were a given, as if my time had already been claimed without my input. I didn't hear it framed as a favor or a request. It came across like a fact everyone else already accepted. No one checked whether I was available, no one asked whether I wanted to, and no one seemed to consider that I might have plans of my own, even if those plans were simply to exist without being responsible for anyone else. What unsettled me most wasn't the number of kids or the timing. It was the confidence behind the assumption, the way my life was spoken about, like it was flexible by default. Like my role had already been assigned and all I had to do was show up. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened, but it was the first time I didn't immediately step in to smooth it over. Instead, I paused, and that pause set off a series of events no one in my family was prepared for, especially the person who believed I'd fall in line without question. Because this time, I didn't adjust my plans, I didn't rush to fix anything, and when the reality finally hit, the reaction on the other end of the phone was pure disbelief. If you've ever had someone decide how you'd spend your time before you even had a chance to speak, stay with me because this story doesn't unfold the way anyone expected. The call came a few days later on an evening that felt completely ordinary, which was probably why I answered without hesitation. My dad's voice was calm, almost pleasant, the kind of tone people use when they believe everything has already been settled and they're simply looping you in. He didn't start by asking if I was free or whether it was a good time to talk. He went straight into logistics, explaining that Christmas was going to be hectic this year and that there would be 6 kids in the house for several days. He spoke smoothly, listing how long everyone would be staying, what days would be the busiest, and how much help would be needed, as if I were already part of the setup rather than someone whose consent still mattered. When I tried to slow him down and asked what he was actually expecting from me, he answered without missing a beat, saying that I would watch the kids while the adults took care of everything else because that was the most practical solution. There was no tension in his voice, no hint that he thought this might be a problem, just the confidence of someone explaining a plan that in his mind made perfect sense. He went on to justify it, pointing out that I didn't have a family of my own yet, that my schedule was more flexible, and that my job allowed for adjustments in a way my brothers didn't. He didn't phrase it as a comparison, but it felt like one all the same, especially when he started talking about how much Daniel had on his plate, how demanding his work was, and how complicated his responsibilities had become. Without ever saying it outright, he placed Daniel's obligations at the top of the list and quietly slid mine beneath them, as if my time existed to absorb whatever didn't fit anywhere else. I felt the shift immediately, not as anger, but as a dull awareness that my availability had been treated as a resource rather than a choice. I told him I hadn't agreed to anything and that I needed time to think, keeping my voice even and measured, not because I was unsure of myself, but because I didn't want the conversation to turn into a fight. I didn't argue or explain my reasons. I simply stated that I needed space to consider what he was asking. There was a brief pause, the kind that happens when someone isn't used to hearing hesitation from you, and then he brushed it off, saying it wasn't a big deal and that it was only for a few days. He added that he knew I would do the right thing once I'd had time to think it over, his confidence unchanged, as if my answer were already written, and my pause was just a formality. The call ended with him sounding reassured, satisfied that the situation would resolve itself the way it always had. When I put my phone down, I realized what unsettled me most wasn't the request itself, but the certainty behind it, the unspoken belief that my time was automatically negotiable while everyone else's was protected, And that realization stayed with me long after the call was over. After the call ended, the apartment felt smaller than usual, not because anything had changed, but because the silence left room for a memory I'd spent years keeping at arm's length. It wasn't a series of moments or a long list of sacrifices, just one specific opportunity that had come and gone so quietly I hadn't realized how much it mattered until much later. At the time, it felt like something I'd earned for myself, a chance, tied to my own interests and momentum rather than anyone else's needs. And I remember being careful with my excitement, keeping it contained, because I wasn't sure yet whether I wanted to commit to it or even say it out loud. I wanted to decide on my own terms without pressure, without having to weigh how inconvenient my choice might be for someone else. I never got that chance. Before I had reached a decision, my dad had already filled in the blanks for me, telling others that I would take care of things, that I'd handle the situation, that it was fine, because I always managed. I didn't hear it from him directly, and no one demanded an explanation from me, because by the time I became aware of what had been said, the plan was already in motion, and my role had been locked in. There was no confrontation, no ultimatum, just an unspoken understanding that everything had been arranged with me in mind, and that stepping away now would mean pulling the rug out from under everyone else. I remember standing there, aware that saying no was technically still an option, but also knowing that doing so would instantly shift the narrative, turning me into the person who caused a problem instead of the person who solved one. So I adjusted like I always did. I rearranged my priorities, let the opportunity pass, and told myself it wasn't the right moment anyway, that it would come around again when things were less complicated. At the time, I didn't feel angry or cheated. I felt practical, as if I were making a reasonable trade without fully acknowledging what I was giving up. It wasn't until much later that the shape of it became clear. No one had forced my hand, and no one had explicitly told me I wasn't allowed to choose differently, but the decision had been made easier for everyone else by being made harder for me. The expectation had been set before my consent ever entered the conversation, and by the time I realized that my participation felt inevitable, rather than optional. Sitting alone in my studio now with nothing but time to think, that realization carried a different weight. I saw how often my silence had been taken as agreement, how easily my flexibility had turned into an assumption, and how comfortable everyone had grown with building plans around my availability instead of my permission. That missed opportunity wasn't about regret, so much as recognition, the moment I understood that I had been treated less like someone with choices and more like a solution that could be counted on without discussion. As I turned that over in my mind, comparing it to the conversation I'd just had with my dad, I found myself hesitating for a different reason this time. I wasn't sure whether what I was considering now was a long overdue attempt to protect my own time, or whether it was simply an easier way to step back and avoid the discomfort that comes with disappointing people who have never learned to ask. The choice didn't come from a moment of defiance or a sudden surge of courage. It formed gradually as I looked at my calendar and realized how much of my time was already spoken for by expectations that weren't mine. Around then, another option solidified, one that had nothing to do with family obligations and everything to do with my own life. It was work-related, something I'd been building toward quietly, an opportunity that required my presence during the holiday period and my full commitment instead of the half availability I'd trained myself to offer. Turning it down wouldn't have ended my career or ruined anything overnight. But the loss would have been tangible, the kind that shows up later as stalled progress and missed credibility, the kind you feel when you keep telling yourself you'll prioritize your own goals next time. I understood immediately that accepting it meant I wouldn't be around, and I also understood exactly what staying would mean. Staying would be easier in the short term. It would keep everything running smoothly, reinforce the idea that I was dependable, flexible, and willing to absorb inconvenience without complaint. It would also confirm once again that my plans were always the first to be rearranged and the easiest to sacrifice. Leaving meant something else entirely. It meant my family would have to notice the gap I usually filled. It meant they would need to adapt, instead of assuming I would. And it meant I wouldn't be there to soften the edges or step in when things became uncomfortable. I didn't frame the decision as a test or a lesson, and I didn't pretend it was morally complicated. One path required me to continue shrinking my own priorities until they barely registered. The other required me to tolerate disappointment that wasn't mine to fix. Once I saw it that way, the choice became less dramatic and more honest. I committed to my own plan, deliberately, not out of resentment, and not to prove a point, but because it was the first option in a long time that didn't require me to step aside from something that mattered to me. I didn't call anyone to announce it, and I didn't offer vague reassurances that could be reshaped into promises, because I'd learned how quickly uncertainty could be turned into obligation. I also didn't warn anyone in advance not to be cruel or strategic, but because I knew that explaining myself too early would invite negotiation, and I didn't want to negotiate away a decision I'd already made. There was no single moment where it felt brave or empowering, just a quiet series of confirmations that locked the plan in place. As the holiday approached, I felt the weight of the choice settle, not as panic or excitement, but as a steady awareness that this time I was choosing with full knowledge of the consequences. I knew people would be inconvenienced, I knew plans would need to change, and I knew the absence that usually went unnoticed until it caused a problem would finally be felt. What surprised me wasn't the discomfort that came with that realization, but the calm beneath it. For once, I wasn't choosing between being helpful and being selfish. I was choosing between repeating a pattern that had cost me more than I admitted and accepting a short-term disruption that protected something longer lasting. The decision didn't make me feel heroic, and it didn't erase the tension I knew was coming, but it did feel responsible in a way I hadn't experienced before, not to anyone else, but to myself. By the time everything was set, I understood that staying would have preserved the illusion that nothing needed to change, while leaving was the first step toward proving that my time was not automatically available, and that was a cost I was finally willing to accept. The shift happened quietly during a family exchange that unfolded with enough confidence to make interruption feel out of place. The conversation wasn't framed as planning anymore, it sounded like confirmation, and my name entered it with an ease that made it clear how firmly everyone believed the decision was already settled. My dad spoke in the same steady tone he used when outlining things that no longer needed discussion, explaining how the holiday days would be split, and stating plainly that I would be watching the kids, while everyone else followed through on their commitments. He didn't look at me when he said it, and he didn't pause afterward as if there were nothing to verify. Daniel and Lauren accepted it immediately, not because they were careless, but because the assumption fit neatly into the structure they were already building. They began organizing their plans around it, adjusting travel times, confirming obligations they would otherwise have had to cancel, and speaking freely about how much easier things would be now that childcare was covered. Each comment reinforced the next, and with every logistical detail they settled, the idea that I would step in became more solid. I listened as the plan took shape in real time, aware that it was being constructed on top of my supposed agreement, even though no one had actually asked for it. When someone acknowledged me, it wasn't to check in or seek confirmation. It was the kind of glance you give to someone whose role is already understood. I responded neutrally when addressed, keeping my tone even and my words minimal, neither confirming nor correcting what was being said. I didn't object, but I didn't endorse it either, choosing restraint over confrontation in that moment. That restraint, however, was quickly translated into acceptance. My dad continued speaking with certainty, referencing the arrangement as finalized, and Daniel and Lauren followed his lead, filling in details that only made sense if my presence was guaranteed. They discussed timing, responsibilities, and contingencies, all of them rooted in the belief that I would be there to manage whatever came up. No one stopped to consider whether that belief was accurate because the confidence behind it made the question seem unnecessary. As the conversation moved forward, I could feel the assumption tightening not through pressure or insistence, but through repetition and shared understanding. The more it was stated aloud, the more official it became, until the idea of pushing back felt less like asserting a boundary and more like dismantling a structure everyone else was relying on. I was aware, even as it was happening, that my silence was being read as consent, that my decision not to interrupt was being folded into the plan as confirmation. There was no single moment where I felt trapped, just a gradual narrowing as each new arrangement reduced the space for a different outcome. By the time the discussion shifted away from logistics, the narrative had been locked in place not because I had agreed to it, but because everyone else had agreed on my behalf. What stood out most wasn't how confidently my dad had spoken, but how seamlessly Daniel and Lauren had trusted that confidence, building their expectations around the idea that my time was available by default. In that exchange, the assumption stopped being private and became collective, reinforced by agreement and momentum, until it existed as a fact that no longer seemed open to question, even though I had never actually given an answer. When the holiday finally arrived, the plan didn't crack slowly, it failed all at once, and the reason was simple: I never showed up. There was no delay to explain it away, and no last-minute excuse to lean on the role everyone had counted on was empty, and that absence exposed how fragile everything actually was. At first, people assumed there had been a mix-up, that I was running late, or caught in traffic, anything that would preserve the version of reality they were comfortable with. But as minutes passed and nothing changed, the mood shifted. My dad was the one who felt it first because he was the person who had spoken with certainty, the one who had told everyone that I would handle the kids and that everything was under control. Now he was standing in the middle of a situation he couldn't manage, with children already there, adults already committed elsewhere, and no replacement in sight. The plan hadn't included a backup because it hadn't needed one, at least not in his mind. That's when my phone lit up. I answered, and before I could say a word, his disbelief spilled out sharp and unfiltered. "What? This can't be happening." His voice wasn't angry yet, it was panicked, stretched thin by the realization that he had to explain himself to people who were already looking at him for answers. I could hear movement and overlapping voices behind him, questions being asked that he didn't have clean responses for, and every sound in the background underscored how public the collapse had become. He asked where I was, why I wasn't there, and why I hadn't said anything sooner, each question layered with the pressure of needing someone else to fix what was unfolding. I told him calmly that I hadn't agreed to watch the kids, and that nothing about my decision had changed at the last minute. I didn't justify it, and I didn't soften it. I simply stated the facts, that I hadn't promised anything, and that the plan he was reacting to existed because he had spoken for me, not because I had committed. That's when the tension shifted. The issue wasn't just childcare anymore, it was credibility. He had to turn back to the others and explain why the certainty he had presented was evaporating in real time, and the more questions he faced, the clearer it became that his confidence hadn't been backed by confirmation. Daniel and Lauren were pulled into the fallout. Their schedules suddenly disrupted, their assumptions unraveling as they realized they had built their plans on something that had never been secured. The frustration in their voices wasn't directed at me, yet it hovered in that uncomfortable space where no one wants to admit they relied on an assumption instead of a conversation. My dad tried to reframe it as a misunderstanding, suggesting that my lack of objection had implied agreement, but I pushed back evenly, reminding him that silence isn't consent and never had been. The harder truth for him to face wasn't my refusal. It was the fact that he now had to account for his words to other people, to explain why he had spoken with authority he didn't actually have. I stayed present on the call long enough to make one thing clear: that I hadn't backed out and that I hadn't changed my mind at the last second, because that story was already starting to form around me. When the call ended, I was left with an unexpected stillness. Not relief, not guilt, just the quiet awareness of how quickly everything had fallen apart once my assumed role disappeared. What unsettled me wasn't their reaction, it was how fast the structure collapsed when it turned out I wasn't there to hold it up. Sitting with that, I couldn't help but think about the question that would inevitably surface: whether this would have ended differently if I had spoken sooner, or whether the assumption had already done its damage long before the holiday ever arrived. Some time passed after the holiday, enough for the anger to burn off, and for the silence to stop feeling temporary. And it was during that quieter stretch that my dad reached out again. The call didn't come with urgency, and it didn't come wrapped in excuses. His tone was slower, more careful, as if he understood that whatever had broken couldn't simply be smoothed over by acting normal. He didn't start by defending himself or blaming the chaos of Christmas. Instead, he said he wanted to be honest about something he had avoided admitting before. He told me that he had spoken for me because it was easier than asking, easier than waiting for an answer that might complicate his plans, and easier than explaining to others that things weren't as neatly arranged as he wanted them to be. He acknowledged that assuming my help had allowed him to feel in control, and that control mattered to him more than he had realized at the time. I listened without cutting him off, not because I was trying to be understanding, but because I needed to hear whether he actually grasped what the problem had been. When I responded, I didn't accuse him of ruining the holiday, and I didn't bring up every time it had happened before I stayed focused on the core issue: the fact that my choice had been removed before I ever had a chance to make it. I told him that what hurt wasn't being needed, it was being decided for having my time treated like a resource that could be allocated without my input. I explained that when plans are announced instead of discussed, it sends a clear message that my consent isn't required, and that over time, that message changes how you see yourself inside your own family. I didn't apologize for not showing up, and I didn't frame my absence as a wake-up call, because I wasn't interested in justifying it anymore. I told him plainly that I couldn't go back to a dynamic where expectations were built around me without my agreement, even if those expectations felt reasonable to everyone else. Then I laid out the conditions not as ultimatums, but as boundaries that weren't negotiable. I said that nothing involving my time could ever be assumed again, that help had to be requested directly, and that I needed the freedom to say yes or no without being guilted, pressured, or spoken for. I made it clear that any support I offered would be a decision I made willingly, not a role I automatically filled, and that silence could no longer be interpreted as consent. He didn't interrupt, and he didn't push back, which told me more than any apology could have. When he agreed, it wasn't dramatic or emotional, it was quiet and restrained, an acknowledgement rather than a promise, and I could tell he understood that this wasn't about one holiday, but about how things would work from that point forward. There was no attempt to restore things to how they used to be, and no expectation that I would step back into my old place, just an acceptance that the terms had changed. We didn't end the call feeling closer, and we didn't end it feeling resolved, but we ended it with clarity, and that mattered more to me than comfort. I didn't feel like I had won anything because there was nothing to win, and I didn't feel like I had lost my family either. What I felt was steady, grounded, aware that I wasn't returning to the person who absorbed responsibility by default, but I also wasn't cutting myself off to make a point. The relationship moved forward on different terms, ones that required conversation instead of assumption, and whether those terms would hold wasn't something I could control. Walking away from that call, I understood that reconciliation doesn't always come with warmth or relief. Sometimes it comes with restraint and distance. And sometimes the most honest ending isn't a declaration of victory or forgiveness, but the quiet decision to remain changed, even if everyone else is still adjusting to that fact. Thank you all for taking the time to watch the video. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming videos.